Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. On today's show, we're going to have the frac spread count. We're going to look at rigs, and then the EIA put up their DUC count update. So we're going to go through DUCs and what we're seeing around those completions, the drilled but uncompleted wells. Then we're going to provide an update on Russia, because a lot of things happened so far this week, especially since we last talked about it on the Econ show, as everything remains very fluid. So let's just get into it, because I know everyone's excited for their weekend. So we had the frac spread count increase by 8. So we went from 275 to 283. Now, just to understand where things are shifting, obviously the Permian, as we were saying, we're back over 150. It didn't take long. But when we look at the expansion, we've had some one-offs in some of the smaller basins, and that's where we got a decent amount of these increases outside of the Permian. Now, even though we're getting frac spreads coming back, I think it's important to understand that there are some limitations that are arising, and one of them is on the logistics side. There's been a shortage of proppant and sand. Some people have said that they haven't been able. They're kind of limited to anywhere from 3 to 5 stages. Some of them only doing about 10. Which is typically a normal project is going to be anywhere between 20 to 28, depending on the rock and obviously the lateral length. So given some of these shortfalls is just going to, even though we might get some activity back, some of that production might be a little bit slower because some of these frac spreads may be on location a bit longer than what is normal. So again, that's also going to have to try to bring back some of this additional capacity. And if you remember, labor has obviously been a huge issue, and a lot of the labor, in order to get people coming back who are like, look, there's prices that have increased everywhere. I can go be in construction, a truck driver, something that's a bit more stable, get good wages. And in order to incentivize, there were signing bonuses and then stage bonuses. Now, how is that going to compensate? That's going to be an interesting piece going forward. All of it is net positive for what we're seeing and what we're expecting. And as frac spreads come back, we are still being outpaced by rig count. So this is what we've been saying. Yes, the rig count in the U.S. was up by 10, but the horizontal was up by 15. So again, you have to look at what is being dropped. So there were 3 vertical rigs that went down, 2 directional, but 15 horizontal. Remember, 15. Sometimes when things get a little bit busier, you have the vertical rig that runs ahead. It'll punch the vertical hole. Then you have that horizontal come across and then go sideways. So based on that, again, we're seeing a lot of these rigs coming back, rigs getting back active. Now, what does that mean for the drilled but uncompleted wells? And remember, there is a certain amount of lag in some of the calculations, but we want to look at where things are. So here you can see that clearly drilled but uncompleted wells are down. They're back to below where we were in 2016. But it's important to look at the rate of change here. So we're starting to see that flatlining, and now we're going to start to see some of this curling back up. But it's important because not all areas are the same. There are some areas that are very low in terms of DUCs. That's the Bakken, the Eagle Ford. Those areas are going to have to see this big increase in activity in order to make up some of that shortfall. But the 3 areas that we've been talking about as being in the best position is the Permian, for obvious reasons, based on liquids and crude. The Haynesville, based on natural gas, as we did that breakdown on LNG last week. And then the Anadarko, when you start looking at the liquids price and where some of those things fall out. So yes, the DUCs have come down, but let's look at where we are in the Permian. The Permian is still above where it was, is right where it was in 2017, but you're starting to see again that flatlining. You look at the Anadarko, still elevated in comparison to where it was in 2018, and the Haynesville is still at a very high level in terms of the available running room. Now, given it's always going to be a matter of, well, how many rigs are running there, how much frac activity is there, but we are seeing these DUCs really turn, and this is what we've been talking about, where in Q1 the goal was stop the DUC decline and get back to growth, so that by the time we get to the end of Q2 and Q3, you're going to have about that 315, 325 spreads running. They're going to have more than enough room in terms of making sure that everybody reaches this number, which we think is that exit rate of that 12.2 to 12.3 million barrels a day on the exit rate. Everything so far continues to be, within our guidance and really kind of falling in line with what our expectations are when we're looking at production in the U.S. Now, some of the important things that we're going to talk about next week, and as we look at the EIA show, we've started to see some shifts. So when you look at PADD 2, we have big builds in gasoline. The gasoline crack has actually gone negative in PADD 2. You now have distillate that's now above the 5-year average, gasoline that's above the 5-year average, and then you had some diesel pricing getting hit on the East Coast based on how things are getting a bit warmer and some of these imports. So we expect run rates, which if you remember, PADD 2 refinery run rates are well over the 5-year average by about 287,000 barrels a day. We expect some of that to come down, but imports to remain fairly stable, just given where some of the backdrop is. So we should see PADD 2 builds start to increase fairly rapidly, just given where crack spreads are, where we think refiners are going to go. And again, this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's as we look over the next 4 to 6 weeks, specifically in PADD 2, because if you remember, that's really where a significant amount of the drop in U.S. storage has happened, is in PADD 2, PADD 2 and Cushing. So those are going to be the two to watch as we start to see some of this pivot, given where product prices are, and where imports are coming into. And now following on that, when we look at imports, so Angola provided a soft announcement of their exports. It's right at about 1.11 million. Nigeria is starting to test the waters. But again, you're seeing something fairly stable, but Russia's obviously all that we can talk about when you look at where is pricing right now. We did a deep dive on some of the impacts and what is being exported from Russia in segment 1 of the Econ show. So we're not going to rehash all of that, but we'll provide a brief update at the end. So when we look at some of the movements right now, we've had some softening. The BP sold Fortes at $2.55 above dated Brent. It was previously $3.30. So you're starting to see some of that come down. You had that big rush to make sure that you could find the barrels away from Urals, away from Russian cargoes in case there were sanctions. And now you're starting to see a little bit of that pressure come off. Now, Glencore offered Urals for March at $3.45 less dated Brent. And then when you look at where that has been, that was at about $3.85. So you're starting to get some movement back. And again, if they're offered, doesn't mean it's being taken, but at least you're seeing the offers come back as you're seeing some of these different things drop. Then when we look at some of the movements, and there was a great question on the EIA show, because you hear what they talk about in OPEC in terms of, the West African problems and why they're not producing. But then we show you where floating storage is in West Africa, which it's at a record, and yet you're still seeing fairly slow exports into Asia. Now, it's going to be important to see how March turns around, because we have seen an increase of super tankers targeting China, and we should start to see them get more active as we go into March. And the Olympics end, they come out of maintenance season. So if West Africa could see some of that benefit, the problem is always going to be dated Brent. Dated Brent is very expensive versus Oman, Dubai, because of what's happening with Russia, Ukraine. So even though in theory it should be better, even though dated Brent, which as we know crossed $100 a barrel, Oman, Dubai becomes the target, which then supports the Middle East. Even though there's more cargoes available in West Africa, it doesn't mean that they're affordable. And that's going to, I think, be some of those important shifts, which we always talk about, and we'll talk about again on the EIA show. But so far in February, 58 cargoes were due to load for Asia in February. Some of that, as you remember, was deferred into March coming out of Angola, so nothing too crazy there. Drops from, so it's at 1.96 million barrels a day, which drops from 2.1 million in January. Typically January and February, as we've talked about, slows down, and then March is going to be kind of that pivotal of how much recovery do we get. Shipments to China edged lower to 1.02 million, down from 1.08. Shipments to India also declined from 649,000 barrels a day to 514. But then when you saw some increases in Indonesia and Thailand, so again, you're starting to see some of these back and forths where we're going to go, and the diffs are really going to kind of dictate how much movement we really see. Now, kind of rounding that out in terms of the U.S. on the gas versus oil side, gas production from shale basins has already overtaken its previous record, and that's not surprising. And if you think about what we showed last week, we're also at a record amount of LNG exports, where we have a large amount of demand within the U.S. So there's enough to absorb that. This isn't something where we're coming out and saying, hey, look at this, like we're going to $2 gas. No, it's that, it's normal. It makes sense given the amount of LNG as we continue to hit records going into the global market. Now, as we go into Russia, one of the big things, and for those that followed our deep dive that I think we did about a month and a half ago, we talked about what happened as NATO expanded, because one of the big issues was when under the Bush administration, we brought in a bit more of these countries, 4 of them to be exact, and that really pushed our relationship with Russia much lower. And so now neither side believes this is going to be accepted, but Russia has thrown out, backing up the NATO expansion and holding it at the 1997 level, which just means that these 14 countries would be kicked out of NATO. Again, very unlikely. And by I say unlikely, I mean impossible. It will never happen. But this is the starting point where then Russia could turn around and say, okay, you don't have to kick them out, but you can't have nuclear weapons in these 14 countries. Now, this is all speculation. I don't have any inside information on this, but there were movements that when there were nukes that were moved out of Turkey, and there were rumors that they ended up in Romania and Hungary. So again, this is a state secret. I don't have that to confirm, but those were the rumors as things shifted out of Turkey when there was all of the problems with Erdogan back in 2019 and 2020. So they could say, look, we know they're there. You know they're there. You don't have to confirm it, but move them. So there's some of that on the nuclear side, and then there's a push to limit the types of equipment that can be deployed into not only Ukraine, but also into these other regions. And these are going to be some of those friction points that they want to push for. While this is happening, we continue to have reports of shelling and small skirmishes in the Lugansk region, and I don't know if I butchered that because I tend to be terrible with enunciations, and Donetsk in terms of those 2 regions. So I know everyone's probably seen it. Russia is evacuating civilians from this region back to mainland Russia. And that's something to consider. But this is the soft point because there's already rebel-held areas. We've seen equipment moving out of Belarus following the end of the military exercises, and they could easily get redeployed to this eastern flank. Eastern flank for Ukraine, western flank for Russia, in terms of trying to push through. Now, there's always been a push to annex this completely. And if you look at just the waterways, if Russia were to do this, they could come across the water, they could hit that from one side directly from Crimea. They could then push down and they could take a huge piece of this land, and it would essentially connect Crimea, because that was something that was always a concern, was how do you connect Crimea to Russia? And by a concern, I mean a Russian concern. So this is something that was always a possibility since 2014 and what was considered to be the most likely outcome. So there is a chance that that could happen, and then they may demand that we recognize this and things move on. Now, not to say that that is a great situation, but Russia doesn't have the capacity to leave an occupation force of over 100,000 troops in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians hate them. They would not welcome them. They would make their lives very difficult. And you open up your Western front, from Russia's perspective, to a potential counterattack and invasion from China. Not to say that it would happen, but again, you essentially overweighted all of your assets into one region and have left yourself open on the Eastern front. So again, these are some of the different pieces that we look at. Now, there was a car bomb. The current claim is that the car bomb belonged to the general in charge of the DPR People's Militia, and that's the ones on Donbas, that essentially this whole region. And then that's led for the local government of Denis Pushilin to order the evacuation of civilians to Russia. So again, there's a lot of movements. There's a lot of moving chess pieces here, but one of the things that we've been saying is that there's going to be a conflict. It's going to be one type of flashpoint, and then that'll be then things will calm down from there. But there will be that flashpoint, and so far it looks like it is gaining ground in this contested region. So then when we look at things that are happening overall, as we shift over into what is happening in the U.S., here's, I think, an interesting one when you look at the disconnect between consumer sentiment and the annual change in leading economic indicators. So one of the things is you're starting to see the sentiment shift, but just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean you're going to start spending a certain way. And our whole thing that we talked about in the Econ show is you're now starting to see the spending going that way. And I think you saw that in the retail sales. And I'm going to go through why I mean that when we start adjusting it for real sales and not just inflation or nominal sales. So then when we look at, before we get into that, how the consumer is shifting, the majority of workers with jobs that can be done from home are teleworking, even as more workplaces have become available. And this is what we've been talking about, the shift in the way people do business and minimizing their movements into the office. And this is how we think things are going to go when we start talking about those flexible schedules. We had the slides that we talked about. I've given several presentations showing it, where their workplace is closed or unavailable is at the lowest, and that they choose not to work from the workplace, and you're seeing that increase. Now, I don't think work from home is a permanent thing, like a permanent work from home, but I think the flexible schedule is becoming more and more likely. So as these things change, the real goods spending, and I think it's very important when you start looking at how things are shifting, you can see the real spending dollars continue to fall as real disposable income comes down. And that's where you're starting to mentally see the shift. People are feeling it, but they haven't started to get there yet because they still have room on their credit cards after paying down credit. And now you're starting to see that way, and we do expect that to accelerate through February and into March as we see those retail sales continue to weaken and consumer spending coming out. And as, again, that's going to hit that broader level of oil demand, crude demand in general, especially as more people just stay home instead of commuting to the office, which will, as we've been saying, shave those weekday travel plans. So that's all we have for you today. If you have any questions, we're always happy to have the conversation in the comments section on Twitter, or in direct messaging, whatever works for you. So we hope you have a great weekend, and thanks for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.